American woman is certainly open for critique, and critique is welcome. They're feminist in critical whiteness theory with 3 recent and profound personal experiences of being a feminist killjoy. So these experiences of me speaking up and speaking out about patriarchy were so profound for me because they were so empowering for me. During and following these experiences, I could feel the energy in my body derived from a sense of angry righteousness, of rightly taking up space and demanding accountability and transformation for not only myself, but for other women and queers too. Yet in these experiences, the men whose patriarchal and sexist power I, a white woman, disrupted are predominantly Black and brown men. So this context of a white American queer woman killing the joy of Black and brown, mostly African, cishet men, implores questions of how that feeling of empowerment that I felt comes to head with a need for me to also give up power. Or as Eileen Morton Robinson asks of white women, how can we theorize the relinquishment of our power? So it's this context that leads to questions about how those positioned as simultaneously marginal and centered, such as white women like myself or Black men, can address critiques and call-outs from one another. And inherent in this is a question of whether one can simultaneously seek empowerment while also giving up power. As a result of this exploration, I unpack common moves, is the kind of term that I'm using, and I'm trying to think a bit with movements and directions and orientations, and how we, in my experience of these, and how I and others can kind of meet one another differently. So as a result of this exploration, I unpack common, what I'm calling moves, such as male fragility, the I acknowledge but, and vying for victimhood, as I encountered by men in response to my feminist killjoy critiques, as a way of analyzing how these moves constitute a reconsolidation of power within the already powerful. From the analysis of these moves, I refract and cast this against whiteness and analyze the dimensions of race present in these moments. I conclude by presenting lessons, reminders, and further questions, because I don't quite have it all figured out, from these intersections and experiences which contribute toward my feminist and anti-racist praxis. So my presentation today is an autoethnographic and autotheoretical discussion of lessons learned from being a feminist killjoy at these multiple intersections. These methodologies, autoethnography, autotheory, and critical life writing, are rooted in feminist and queer traditions which see value in surfacing silent stories and disrupting positivist myths about the detached, distanced, and objective researcher. In these traditions, turning to the self as a site of questioning and theorizing is not because the self is fully knowable, but rather to make meaning of the mundane and the everyday, to analyze particular patterns which can help to reveal the wider workings of power, and to notice my own investments, emotions, thinking, and responses, and what that tells me about my feminism. So while my abstract for this presentation outlined a bit of a wider paper and a kind of broader personal project of playing with these methodologies of autoethnographic and autoethnography and autotheory in relation to my feminism, I've narrowed it slightly today for the sake of time, which I hope. And if I don't discuss or rely on each of these 3 experiences that I reference, they still inform a lot of my thinking and my questioning. So the first experience that I rely on is reporting my former Black American male professor and mentor for sexual harassment and this was done through a US-based university, and the resulting restorative justice process once he was found guilty of that sexual harassment, not only against me, but 2 other women as well. So the second of these feminist killjoy moments or experiences is actually multiple moments of being a feminist killjoy in a progressive, critical, decolonial South African university space, where I have called out Black African male colleagues for inviting a known abuser to lead an event, as well as critiquing the implicit unequal gender roles and burden of emotional labor which is ongoing in the space. And the final moment or experience was my first time lecturing feminist theory at a historically white South African university, and utilizing a feminist Killjoy philosophy in my teaching and pedagogy. So, and while I'm using these three different experiences together to analyze patterns and ways patriarchal power is operating, I do not want to imply that I'm equating all of the men in these stories to one another, or what they've been involved in, or what they've been accused of. You know, my professor, mentor sexually harassed and assaulted me. The male colleagues I describe in the critical decolonial and progressive space did not, and that's important to acknowledge. And I also hope that I'm not making any kind of universal claims about a kind of black masculinity, but rather I'm just trying to tease out some of the patterns and things I noticed from my experience, which are also reinforming my feminism in new ways. So I want to begin by highlighting some of these common moves by the black and brown men in response to my feminist Killjoy critiques. And functionally, what these moves do is resist acknowledging complicity in the problem and taking accountability for one's role in the ongoing system of unequal power. And so the first move that was quite prominent across these experiences was a kind of male fragility. And I'm not using this in the kind of sense of masculinity studies in which men are described as being anxious because they're not living up to some kind of manhood or expected hegemonic masculinity, although there could be some of this operating. But I'm more so using the concept of fragility in line with Robin DiAngelo's conception of white fragility, when she describes white people being so defensive in response to mere conversations about race and being asked to consider our own race. Similarly, the men in my experiences have also shown a kind of fragility to withstand feminist critique. These moves of defensiveness and fragility when asked to consider their own, whether conscious or not, complicity in patriarchy and sexism, seeks to regain control and reorient power back to the already powerful. So it's an attempt to restore this kind of fantasy of happiness or a myth of the joy and harmony before the kind of killjoy disruption. So one example of this from the second experience of being in a progressive, decolonial, critical space was the one instance in which I attempted to call out the very obvious gendered roles in the space, and another feminist also expressed solidarity with me, and also a lot of anger at the situation and the responses from some of the men. In which she suggested that us women should down our tools and basically stop contributing to the emotional and kind of domestic labor in the space. And in doing so, she referred, and I also referred, to men generally in our responses and critiques, in which one male colleague responded by saying, by giving the very stereotypical line of "not all men," right? And he was attempting to educate us why our generalizations about men were so problematic, and he was very aggrieved and affronted by this. We were also branded as the source of divisions. We were branded as divisive, and you know, as Sarah Ahmed has described, you know, that's kind of the most common response to feminist killjoys, right? the issue being called out gets marginalized, and the people who bring in that bad feeling, right, become the problem, not the actual problem themselves, right? The example I have of this is from the first experience I had with the professor mentor who was found guilty of sexual harassment. So he was also a very powerful person in the community. If any of y'all have read the chapter, "The Walls Spoke When No One Else Would," the three accusers of the decolonial scholar D'Souza de Santos. I always mess up his name, but that's fine. But three former students and employees in that space wrote a chapter in which they also unpack this kind of star professor quality, in which that oftentimes brings in young women only to kind of groom and sexually harass and abuse them. And that chapter resonated a lot with my experience with this professor, right? He was very celebrated in the community. He was an anti-racist activist. He was also on the Sexual Harassment Commission of the university, which was interesting. So you can get the sense of the positioning of him in the space, right? And he had those kind of credentials around social justice, right? He had the language and the knowledge in being able to kind of articulate issues of things like even sexual harassment, which he's participated in. So when I reported him, and it began through the investigation, the formal investigation process through the university, he immediately admitted to sexually assaulting me, immediately. He said without a doubt in the interview with the lawyer that he did it, and that he would take responsibility for it. But, so in that, and in the one breath, I was like, wow, that's amazing. He acknowledged it. He admits that what he did caused me harm. But it was followed by so many explanations, caveats, irrelevant information, questioning, why would I stay in a relationship with him as a mentor? And while the admission was powerful, it was very much minimized by all of the things that followed in the butt, right? Mm-hmm. Because what that did was it served to try and protect him. And that's quite a natural thing. I think when we are critiqued, we do have those kind of natural defensive moves, right? And the one thing that he said, which is quite egregious, in one of the caveats that he provided, and this is quoted from the actual report, was he said that in describing the non-consensual kiss that he gave me, he said that it was, quote, not thorough though, as if to imply that it wasn't that bad, right? So you can admit, in the one hand, I admit to these issues, but all of these other things should mediate perhaps my taking kind of full responsibility and accountability for them. And the final one is this vying for victimhood, which ties into some of my my PhD work, which also looks at vulnerability and vulnerability politics. And there's an ongoing contestation for victimhood or vulnerability as a means for escaping accountability, as well as for attempting to speak from a position of moral authority. Anne Curry Stevens calls this the race to innocence, in which those from privileged positions discount their privileges and instead present their sources and experiences of marginality and oppression to the center. And so the examples that I have to give about this lead into then my next part of the discussion, and I'm wondering how I'm doing with time. 2 minutes! Ah! Okay. So I haven't even gotten into the second half. So in this kind of vying for victimhood as well, right? One of the, in two of the experiences, but I did also notice this a lot in my classroom, right? Is this sense of kind of men being besieged and under attack by feminists, by a kind of cancel culture, right? But the other thing that happened was in the first two experiences, claims of racism were brought up. So in the first instance with the professor, he claimed that he was a victim of targeted racism by the university. So that wasn't necessarily leveled against me, but in communicating to me that another student reported him for sexual harassment, the first thing he said was, but it's all racism, and it's an attack against me, and it was also just a misunderstanding between him and this young student, right? So again, the kind of escaping from owning and taking accountability. In the second experience, I was accused of racism, and this is somewhat unfortunate because this is kind of where this leads into the discussion about my whiteness that is also very much present in these spaces, right? So I was accused of racism for saying that I said that I'm exhausted of educating men, and as a brown man, he felt harmed by that because of the kind of colonial. I see time is up. Because of the kind of colonial legacy of white people's attempts to kind of educate, right, the indigenous populations. So I see that I'm out of time, and I haven't even really gotten to the crux of it, but I do. Can I just like list the points? Okay. So the other kind of, I lead this into it, then a discussion about, what does that mean? Okay, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can condense this coherently, kind of off the cuff. But I do talk about the really kind of unequal ways in which I was believed. I was believed in my claims and accusations. Institutions made space to hear my claims, which is very much a function of my whiteness, right? And because in the ways that, as much as I have experienced patriarchal violence, right, that has been very much mediated and comforted by my whiteness, right? My experience of life is very much made easier by the fact that I'm white. So I do talk about that, and I do have some lessons that I've learned from this. But the main one that I would just like to end with is for me, it's kind of it's been a kind of reorientation for my feminist practice, right? So Jamil F. Khan, critical scholar and my good friend, offered the suggestion of decentering men, and so that has kind of been the reorientation that I have taken from all of this, in that instead of trying to kind of keep convincing men who are clearly not wanting to listen, right? Where can I take my energies elsewhere? And that is to feminism, feminists, women, queers, and instead of investing so much energy in trying to convince, rather kind of redirecting those energies elsewhere. Thank you so much, and I'm very sorry I went over time, but thank you.
Hello everybody. My name is Sonkosi, but I always like to introduce myself. Yes. ndiyacama gusha ndithi makube ixhosa ibehele kudede umnyama uvele ukhanya ndiyacama gusha and I honor everybody in this room. I will start here. I was never raised to be black by my grandparents. I was raised to be Xhosa and to be African. They raised me to embody Ubuntu and to respect my elders and everyone around me, to honor my ancestors and the ways of my people. They taught me to pray to God. They taught me how to be human and how to respect other humans. The first time I learned that I was black was when I went to school. I was told that I'm black. I have to tick a box that says I'm black. I learned to be black when my cousins came from multiracial schools and told me that I was a gaffer and I had gaffer hair. They came back and told me that I was too dark and therefore I was not beautiful. As I grew up, I started to understand what it meant to be black. I was raised in isolation in rural areas, so I had never been black in my life. I had never experienced blackness. I went to boarding school in a rural area. There I never felt black. We're a mixture of Xhosa, Sotho, and Zulu girls and boys. Again in varsity, I encountered blackness. All the courses focused on Western ways of knowing, and other courses never included African writers. Even though it was a predominantly black university or historically black university, the only course that included an African writer, Steyn, only had 2 lines, and they were talking about black inferiority and white superiority. Even after graduating, I realized that no man, the theories I was taught could never speak to the realities of my community. I learned that to be black is to be poor, lazy, to not be intelligent, to be a burden to society. It is about accepting that you are inferior. In my joint PhD between Rhodes University and Freya Universiteit, I was then expected to go for 4 months to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. My study deals with black women. I was told that please do not be surprised when you come here and no one identifies as black. The word does not exist here or it is not used officially. While I was applying for the visa and applying for accommodation, I would be lying if I would say that I felt black. I did not have to put in extra effort as the system saw me as an African student. I was African now. My identity had changed from black to African. One other important factor was going to a country where the people who had oppressed, terrorized, and killed my ancestors had arrived. I was filled with so many feelings around that. So this was a bittersweet experience. My experience was different now. In seminars, I could participate without feeling black. There were times where I felt microaggression because even though they say that we don't see color, or we are colorblind, but the experiences of marginalized ethnicities have not yet been well researched. I was seen as African. All the stereotypes about African people now came to the fore. We think we are backward. We live in the jungle and that what defines us is poverty. For some odd reason, I was not moved in any way by these comments. I was proud to be African. I even wore my Xhosa beads to the presentations. I did not care how they perceived me, as racism is subtle. People will engage with you professionally, but they will exclude you socially at times. That did not matter to me because I had access to things that in South Africa would take me months to fight for. I even had access to safety because I did not feel unsafe as a woman there. I did not have to wonder, am I next? Am I next? I had access to a privilege I never thought I would have, safety as a black woman. I remember the day I came back to my country, South Africa. I was scared I would have to be black again and be unsafe as a black woman. And sure enough, I had a presentation in Cape Town. I was met with the expectation of having to learn to be black again and to know my place. But the experience I had in Amsterdam changed me. I did not want to be black again. I was not willing to relearn it. In fact, I am unlearning it and relearning my Africanness and Xhosanness. After having this experience, I started to question, what does black mean? What does woman mean? This is where I was challenged to really pay attention to what does black mean. It made me realize that I had accepted the definition of black growing up in South Africa, that I had never questioned or challenged. This perhaps is unsurprising, you know, because the conception of race is narrow, and I had been raised with this, so this was a significant learning experience for me. Am I still good with time? Okay, let me continue. Now, thank you for joining my presentation. So I present this under the idea of an intersectional analysis of black doctoral candidates' experiences. I am delighted to share my ongoing PhD research with you. The objective of my study is to understand how black female PhD candidates experience their doctoral studies at Rhodes University in South Africa and Vrije University in the Netherlands, Amsterdam. Specifically, I aim to explore how their intersecting identities, including race, gender, and class, influence their doctoral journeys. By utilizing an intersectional and African framework, I seek to shed light on the unique and often overlooked aspects of their experiences. And as I mentioned before, in this research, I delve into the multifaceted nature of blackness and womanhood, and recognizing that these categories are not easily defined. Issues of terminology and categorization are essential, as they have real consequences for the lives of those who use them and are subsumed within particular definitions. As Maya Angelou eloquently expressed in her poem Phenomenal Woman, black women should embrace their identities without apology and resist fitting into predefined boxes. This sentiment underscores the need to challenge societal expectations and explore the complex interplay of race, class, and gender within the experiences of black female PhD candidates. Now, in looking at racism or race, we understand that it is deeply ingrained in society, and it has structured society for centuries. And it has had significant implications for the individuals that are based in these racial identities. Apartheid in South Africa is a good example of this, of how ideologies of racial superiority and inferiority have manifested in various social structures, including higher educations. Black citizens were systematically marginalized and restricted from accessing quality education. Now, what we need to understand is that it is important to recognize that race is not a biologically determined category. The notion of distinct races lacks a genetic basis, as highlighted by scientific research, and attempts to legitimize racial and social structures through pseudoscience have historically sought to prove the superiority and the inferiority of certain racial groups. Now, the fallacy of race as a biological determinant is further undermined by the understanding that racial identities are socially structured, constructed, and they vary across different geographical contexts. What it means to be black in America is not the same as what it means to be black in South Africa and what it means to be black in the UK. Now, by critically examining the history of racial ideologies and their impact, we can challenge the oppressive systems that perpetuate discrimination and marginalization. Turning our focus to the concept of womanhood, we understand that there's not one way to be a woman. Women express and they embody womanhood in different ways, but society has often put women into a box and told them that you are a woman and this is how you should be. And we understand that, especially focusing on black women, is that we embody womanhood or blackness in different ways. So we cannot put people in those boxes because they differ in terms of cultures, religion, classes, races, and levels of education. So as we navigate the complexities of womanhood, it is imperative to recognize and challenge societal norms that restrict women's autonomy and reinforce oppressive gender stereotypes. Now, this is where in my research I talk about the notion that woman is often positioned as weak and fragile. But I look into pre-colonial times. I draw examples of the powerful women that held powerful positions. Queen Zinga, Mkabayi, the Rain Queens, the women soldiers of the Dahomey tribe. And so in my study, I use an intersectional lens to study the experiences of black women. But also, what I do is I borrow ideas or I use African feminisms to speak to intersectionality. So I borrow ideas from ecofeminism to recognize that even though one is structured by society, but they have the power to negotiate and navigate their way through society. So it helps us to understand the agency of the individual. To understand that even though you might be structured by society, but your fate is not determined by society. So we understand that when we study black women, I think I started like this when I was starting my PhD. I thought of studying black women from a position of marginalization. But then as I thought of it, I said, no. You need to study black women from a position of power because these people have agency. And even though there are these structures around them, but then I thought of my grandmother's feminism. How did she navigate her way through negotiation, through going around patriarchy? And this is what is happening with black women. Not all of them, but some of them use this, and that is why I used it in my study, the idea of ecofeminism. So now, the important thing, 5 minutes left, but I'll be done by then. It was important for my study to ask the women to self-identify as black or as women, so that I not necessarily give them the power, but they have the power. The power is in their hands to say, no, I will not be in your study because I don't identify as black, I don't identify as woman. Now, I employed a narrative methodology that centers the voices and stories of black female doctoral candidates by providing participants with a platform to authentically share their experiences through interviews and photo voice. I empower them to express their journeys in their own words. The qualitative approach ensures that the findings are grounded in the lived realities of the participants, allowing for a comprehensive examination of their experiences. So I think one thing that research methods do not talk about enough is the emotional work that is involved in doing research that directly affects you. I found myself censoring myself at times during seminars and the like because I did not want to be seen as the angry black woman who is always complaining, the lazy black or darky who is not intelligent. But I had to choose, I still had to position myself. I had to choose who I was going to be in the space, even though I was aware that others would position me as they liked. I chose to be the opinionated African woman, the Xhosa woman with a loud mouth. As the Xhosa people say, umlomo sisilonda sasiko, sakhola wenzelwe uthetha, which means the mouth is a wound that was cut and healed a long time ago. So it is made for voicing out issues. I cannot remove myself from this study or pretend that I'm not there. When I was interviewing my participants, I was there. Even when listening to the recordings, I am there. My own experiences are present. I am there in every word that is spoken. I am still there in the process of writing my thesis. I'm never absent. The use of strong theory, intersectionality, and African feminisms help me to see beyond my own experiences and to identify social structures, which means social structures which I might not be aware of. But even as I added these tools to my process, I remained who I am. Uzoch.
Come on.
I have documented a paper that I've written on sexuality education in Africa. This was part of a broader project that was coordinated by a close friend of mine, Mtshali, and so we were a group of people who looked at the issue with different angles. Now, here's my problem. If I don't follow the script, I'm going to completely go off the topic. So I have to read as a way to just keep myself rooted. So my name is Ibrahim. I work in the university. Doesn't matter which one. I work in the university. Like many of you, I am a student of what's called the Black Radical tradition. It's a tradition that embraces different, what we can call counter-hegemonic knowledge and activist projects. It includes feminism, particularly Black and African feminism. So I'm here to learn about from different people about African feminism. Not that I've not been making my own efforts. So yeah, that's my political commitments. I'm going to say first of all something about the way I use intersectionality, and then say a few things about what I consider to be the problem with the way sexuality education has been practiced in Africa, based on, secondly, data, and then make my case very briefly for why I think an intersectional approach to sexuality education would be more liberatory than is currently the case. Okay, so let's see how that goes. Anybody, I'm a great fan of Sylvia Tamale's work, but I draw, for purposes, in the context of the paper that I've written, I drew on Patricia Hill Collins and Selma Bolz's conceptions of intersectionality. More specifically, I think of intersectionality as a radical praxis, right? For producing knowledge about underlying causes, right? Producing knowledge about underlying causes of oppression, inequality, and inequity, as well as for social justice activism. That part is important to me. It's important to me because I think of intersectionality not just as an intellectual tool, but also as a political tool. Yeah? Something that you can use to do something with, as opposed to, I think there's just too much pervasive tendency to confine intersectionality to intellectual discussions about, if it's not about having to motivate, what is its theoretical value? Yeah, it's about thinking how it can help us to understand intersecting social identities. And I think that intersectionality is actually originally has been thought to do much more than that. Right? In fact, the origin story of intersectionality is located outside the university. Yeah? So that's why I think of it in that way. The alternative is what Sonkosi refers to as a depoliticization of intersectionality, which I explain, which I say is the problem, where, intersectionality is just kind of quarantined or confined in constant theoretical reflections or contemplations about what it is, right? And less about what it can do. So that's the kind of way in which I think about intersectionality, which is quite instructive and useful for the case I want to make about how can be used as a tool in sexuality education, because it's about what it can do, right? So that's my position on intersectionality. Now, in terms of the one body that I feel offers a comprehensive definition of sexuality education is UNESCO, and according to the definition that they offer of sexuality education, it is a curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about the cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. Cynthia, I have to read because otherwise we're not going to be able to stick to the time. Cynthia Wangamati explains that educators in sub-Saharan Africa deploy 3 approaches to sexuality education. So these are the 3 dominant approaches in how sexuality education is practiced in different African countries. The first is a faith and cultural based approach. Second is a public health approach, and a rights-based approach. So these are the 3 different ways in which sexuality education is being practiced. So the first one promotes a religious-based reasoning, for sexual abstinence from marriage, before marriage. The second one is focused on raising awareness about sexual reproductive health problems, such as sexually transmitted infections, unplanned pregnancies, etc. And the third approach is concerned with young people's sexual reproductive health rights, diversity, gender equality, and so forth. Now, though well-intentioned, available evidence suggests that none of these 3 approaches has actually been able to deliver liberatory learning outcomes that is generated from different ways of knowing, right? For instance, scholars who work on sexuality education, such as Cezanne Gabaza and Tamara Scheffer, argue that, quote, rather than challenging normative gendered and sexual narratives and facilitating agency and equality for young people with respect to gender and sexuality, education at school has tended to regulate and discipline young sexualities, has reinscribed binarisms of gender and sexuality and heteronormativity. Several studies on sexuality in education in Africa agree that sexuality is generally being discussed through a patriarchal lens. Robert Engelman, for example, observed that there's a lack of interest to deal with issues affecting non-binary youth in formal and non-formal educational institutions. I mean, one of the areas where this is quite obvious is the issue of HIV/AIDS, right? And how that is being addressed. So Ngabaza and Scheffer argue that discussions on HIV/AIDS reinscribes, quote, normative gender and sexual binarism. Young women, they indicate, are made responsible for the sexual behavior of men. Moreover, the author suggests that sexuality education is steeped in colonial logics of African sexualities. When they write that, quote, sexuality education messages are primarily framed as civilizing discourse in relation to young people, and for the most part presented in didactic methodologies where young people are told what to do while their own voices are silent and marginalized. In other words, discussions on HIV are not aimed at empowering young people, but rather at forcing them to self-regulate their sexual behavior in accordance with moralistic beliefs of the elders. This way of talking about HIV/AIDS, as Sylvia Tamale asserts, validates the colonial depiction of Africans as sexual deviants, who need to be moralized by Europeans. It therefore comes as no surprise that sexuality education is having little effect on HIV infections among young people. Now, here's my case. It's my contention that an intersectional feminist approach to sexuality education will increase the prospects of comprehensive sexuality education being truly liberatory. An intersectional feminist approach will give voice to different social experiences among young people, recognize their social agency, and feminist methods such as storytelling and reflexivity will give those who engage in CSE a more transformative learning experience. So here I'm thinking about how intersectionality can be used as a pedagogical tool, yeah, in sexuality education. Of sexuality education, an intersectional feminist lens will promote critical thinking about the underlying structural causes of sexual reproductive health problems and of gender-based violence. The focus on individual behavior, which is so prevalent in comprehensive sexuality education, obscures the impact of structural issues such as class and racial inequalities and institutionalized homophobia on the sexual and reproductive health challenges faced by young people. Importantly, an intersectional feminist approach to sexuality education brings power into the discussion on sexual and reproductive health, on gender inequality, and on gender-based violence. It is difficult to understand how sexuality education can develop critical thinking skills among young people without dealing with the issue of power. An intersectional feminist approach challenges us to be wary of the tendency implicit in human rights discourses to homogenize the beneficiaries of rights. In addition, it calls for critical understanding of diversity. Diversity discourse tends to reduce experiences of discrimination and marginalization to prejudice, suggesting that equity could be achieved if those with power in corporate and public institutions correct their behavior to accommodate those who were historically excluded from these institutions. Is that it depoliticizes the struggle against exclusion and equity. It is only a structural understanding of diversity, in my view, which is rooted in a critique of structural racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy that can contribute to a transformative understanding of difference. Otherwise, what diversity produces is a difference that doesn't actually make any difference. An intersectional feminist lens will challenge young people to understand how structural violence can perpetuate gender-based violence. Gehin's work I've read show how health inequity within the healthcare system could be a contributing factor to gender-based violence against transgender persons. And I wanted to just make this point that I feel that the experiences of marginalization of transgender persons in particular is not something that is actually well discussed. Not much light is shed on that. And I feel that if there is so much to learn about the connections between structural violence and state violence through understanding the experiences of transgender people. Yeah? So the lack of access to gender-affirming healthcare for transgender persons has negative legal and socioeconomic effects on the lives of transgender persons, as it can force them into precarious forms of work, such as sex work, rendering them vulnerable to sexual violence, disease, arrest, and incarceration. So you can't talk about sexual reproductive health without connecting it to the structural problems, connecting it to structural violence. Okay, so that's the point I'm making. The latter draws attention to the role of the state, because that's the other thing that's often excluded from the debate. How the state itself is the perpetrator of violence. So the latter draws attention to the role of the state and structural forms of violence in health inequity and gender-based violence. My final point is that it's correct that women are increasingly entering the formal labor market, and the need to protect it, and they need to be protected by laws to be free from sexual harassment in the workplace, right? As Lynn Osome explains, many women are also working in the informal labor markets in African countries. In fact, this is what is dominant, the form of work performed by women in most African countries. In fact, more than between 60 and 80% of women working in African countries work within some form of informal work, right? So my point is that many women are working in informal labor markets in African countries, and they too require legal protection from sexual harassment and knowledge and skills to resist sexual violence in the workplace. One concrete way in which I think this could be achieved is by integrating sexuality education into worker education. To make the connections between the two. Anyway, that's my thing.
I think about this often with regards to the power struggles between white women and colonized men. There's a very weird relationship that plays out there, because it's as if they are holding each other to ransom. You know that there's a meme out of a Nigerian movie where there are two women lying on the floor and they're both pointing guns at each other. That's what happens there. Because the colonized men are holding white women to the potential for racism, and white women hold colonized men to the potential for misogyny. But the point about that power struggle is that black women and queer people get caught in the crossfire of that, because neither one of those groups are important to either in the fight. So the point is that to black women and queer people, both of those people in that power struggle become a figure of untrustworthiness, right? And so when you talk about decentering men, I think what your work is to figure out how you gain the trust of black women and queers. And therein, creating that relationship of trust and then entering into agreement of solidarity is where a solution towards freedom lies. Because the reality is that colonized men are in a struggle to not dismantle power, but usurp power from white men. And white women themselves are also engaged in that battle of trying to usurp that power from white men, but neither of them have the power to stand up to white men. And so that is not where your work lies, because that's a futile endeavor, because if we want to actually dismantle, then that's what we must actually do. But if we're not in a position to do that, then we must invest our energies elsewhere.
Thank you. I'm covered. Jamie. Okay, so I mean, firstly, I'm sorry for what happened with the supervisor, right? We see men in position of power, especially in universities, getting away with sexual harassment issues. I mean, just most recent, the UP Vice Chancellor is one of those people. And that is scary and disgusting that those people are able to do that. And obviously, the stuff is political, right? So in that happening, have we seen, or are we going to see any repercussion except for them being dismissed by the universities? Because it is a crime, regardless of the fact that it is at an institutional level, but also just that is something that needs to be looked at as well. So, what are your thoughts on that? And also just having these sexual harassment policies, sexual harassment officers, is that sufficient? For the two of you. I mean, that's like an important study that you guys looked into, right? And my biggest question right now is, while we wait for the implementation of the policies, what are some of the practical, everyday interventions that can be happening or that can take place in a communal sense? What can be done while we're waiting for policy?
Enjoy the complexity in what you are doing, right? Because I get this. I get this part of the debate that says I didn't know I was black. I think a lot of African people who are not South African And I hate doing that because then I become that South African who calls other people African. But I just haven't figured out how to do it properly yet. Yeah, but they also say similar things, right? About not knowing that they were black or not knowing that they were African before they collided with whiteness. And I wonder then, like, what we can take from that discussion and those conversations, because there is such a thing as blackness, right? And there is such a thing as Africanness. But if we're only discussing blackness and Africanness from having whiteness as our center, then obviously then it becomes your latecomers, lazy, unintelligent, you know. But the thing is that blackness, Africanness existed, has always been. You know, earlier this morning we were having a discussion about the rainbow, but we've always had a rainbow, you know, and we've always had ourselves as black people. We've always had blackness, and blackness will always persist. But how do we then embrace that persistence? What does it look like when we are embracing that persistence without centering whiteness? By or rather actually doing the work of decentering whiteness so that we can have our persistent blackness.
Corporate in the workplace, especially when you look in terms of sexual harassment, because we do note that when it comes to the workspace, that dynamic in the whole is not very much inclusive of everything else. Sorry, I forgot your name. Jamie, with all that has been said even by everyone, I think I note that also time was against you. And then I think for me, my question, because you spoke much of what you call moose, which is male fragility, and especially if you link to what Mary has said, I think we need to also just look in terms of, because for me that looked at as an approach of white fragility as well. I was a bit skeptical as to who the who part was, because in some incidences I think you were also just a bit comfortable where I think you were referring more of male fragility in a blackness type of sense, which for me can be a bit concerning, because then you need to acknowledge, you don't make arguments to say that are not all men. And I think then what most people come out, if I'm sensing that, is that it will be, what about the white men, not black men, right? So there is a pattern to just look at that, especially with what the power dynamics that we have also just pointed out. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I really enjoyed that. That's my
policy recommendations to be implemented. I think that one thing that we need to understand is that there's been a breakdown in terms of kinship dynamics. So kin is no longer as involved in childcare as it once was, and there are various reasons for that. But what women can try to do is just build stronger relationships with friends, with neighbors. You know, they will need a combination of childcare arrangements in order to try provide decent and quality childcare for their children. And also I think pressure needs to be put on the Department of Social Development. There's no reason that in 2023 in Umlazi there's an ECD that doesn't have sufficient bedding for children for nap time, or food does not come on time. There's no reason for all of that today, you know. So we also need to put pressure on the relevant departments to do the bare minimum of what they're supposed to be doing.
But I also appreciate all the comments and responses that I received, and I think that I don't say it as eloquently as Jamil, but I do go on to talk about that dynamic of the power struggles between white women and black men, and this kind of vying for the proximity and power of white men. And again, the kind of erasure of black and African women and queers in that equation, which is, I think, what led me to my point as well, which, again, Jamil articulated better than I did. But that refocusing for myself and my feminism on building that trust with Black women. One of the things that also I learned throughout these processes is my relation with women of color that I work with, women of color that showed up throughout the sexual harassment process and restorative justice process. And I've learned a lot in those moments of yeah, what does it mean to show up for one another, and when might I also be rushing toward calling out before also checking in with the women of color that will also be affected by my actions. And so that is something that I've learned, and that is something that I think it is part of what I want to incorporate, into my actions going forward. Yeah, and I think that also relates to your comment at the end. Sorry, you're bothering next to you in the back. Yeah. And I could have also written a paper about the white men that I've also called out, and that's mostly my family. And so I do take the point that I perhaps need to tease out the differences also, particularly when I'm speaking about Black and brown men. And one of the things I also didn't get to mention was that, of course, also white women accusing Black men of sexual harassment, sexual assault is a long history, a lethal history, quite literally deadly. And when I think about the risks I take to be a feminist killjoy, it's really not that much. The risks are not that consequential for me, and that's largely mediated by my class, my Americanness, my whiteness. So I don't know where I'm going with that. But yeah, just to say that I hear you, and I do think that I can work on that. And in terms of the last questions around sexual harassment policies, was that?
Oh no, that was last one.
Yes, sorry. So I don't actually do a lot of research on sexual harassment policies. However, I would recommend, there's a project called Feminisms that's currently ongoing, where they're studying sexual harassment policies across South African universities. So it's called Feminisms. Stands for, each thing stands for something. But they're doing a lot of work on that, which you might be interested in exploring what they have to say about the actual policies. In my experience, obviously I was at an American university, and in which there are certain legal Title IX, which has certain protections for women and such. But also there were particular things. He was retiring at the time, so he couldn't be fired. He was able to retire with his full severance. He was still able to go up for a vote for Professor Emeritus within his faculty. So although I say that, I was listened to, the institution did respond, they heard me, they found him guilty. But I still felt, certain inadequacy with the outcome. But I also don't know, had he been fired, would that have made me feel better? Would that have been more justice? I don't know. I also made the active choice not to go public with the story against him. And of course, one of the issues I think with sexual harassment, policies in South African universities and in my case is the issues around privacy. You're not meant to reveal any identifying information, and they often position that as in the interests of survivors, but it serves to protect universities from liability and kind of reputational damage. So I think that from my understanding seems to be a big point of issue with kind of wider conversations about whether or not universities are handling sexual harassment adequately or not, that particular point around privacy. And I say that as well because I only found out another student reported him because he told me, because he was dumb enough to tell me. But that just, and then another student reported after me. And this was all under the guise of privacy. People in his own department don't even know what happened. So how and I mean that also says something about the kind of whisper networks we have in which we share knowledge, around these kinds of issues. But I imagine what would happen if it wasn't private? What would happen if at least those in the department knew about this and students could say, me too, Because obviously we are not the only ones. Yeah.
So the leadership
just say that this is in detail, right? It was important for me to first understand how did we get here, because sometimes you say, okay, I want to understand Africanness and blackness without whiteness, but then we understand that why, and we have to understand why did this happen, why was blackness even there in the very beginning, right? So by me going into is blackness an experience? Is blackness a skin color? Is blackness the way you are built, or is it about your melanin? Just asking those questions and asking the questions of how all of this was constructed, because we can't fix anything here. Like this idea of a black woman is at the bottom of the barrel, but how did that happen? How did that come to be? So we always have to go back to answer those questions of whiteness, because I do have a colleague who's also looking at what does it mean to be white and understand that, maybe understand it from the point of blackness, but in my research, I look at imposed identities, I look at self-claimed identities. So now you understand that this is an imposed identity. As I said, that society will structure me the way it wants to structure me, even though I may say that, this is who I am. But then when I work there, man, woman, they decide the class, they decide whatever. But then society does that, but then you always have your agency.